You got action? Volume?
Okay, we've got the juice working here. And first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming. But I think with this panel, we've got plenty of juice. So, one of the things I want to do is after we have an opportunity to hear the panel, I want to allow 40 minutes for questions because I think a lot of you will have questions, and we look forward to that because that's the whole idea here, is to get a good interchange. We will be examining the strength of the U.S. economic recovery and its prospects for boosting the global economy. I've been asked to give you a few of my own thoughts, which I'll keep fairly short, and then get into the discussion that I mentioned. The U.S. economy has clearly improved, and according to the Institute of International Finance, the IIF, it's expected to grow by about 4.3% this year. It is also expected that the U.S. recovery will lead the way for global growth. The strength of the global economy is still very much dependent on the U.S., the locomotive effect. And this is especially given the less than stellar figures that we are seeing from the other G7 economies, which I think is why the topic today is so important and relevant. Is the U.S. expansion sustainable? Well, I think things look pretty good, and there are clear signs of a rebound in the U.S. economy. Consumer spending is still fairly strong. Business spending has improved. Manufacturing is starting a comeback after a big slump. Housing figures continue to be strong. Productivity is up, and inflation and interest rates are at the bottom. I think we can expect a fairly strong run on the economy, probably right up to the presidential elections. And that's one of the questions I'm going to be asking our panelists to comment on. Last year, we obviously saw a lot of fiscal and monetary stimulus, including the $350 billion tax cut package that was passed in May, the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates and higher government spending, mostly due to the war in Iraq and the fight against terrorism. Nevertheless, and this is very important, we can't forget the twin deficits, decline in the dollar, and very importantly, the fear about jobs. They're all still question marks about the sustainability of U.S. growth as we go forward. In fact, two things have surprised most economists and people in general. One is the job market has not come back as anticipated, and the housing market has stayed strong. The job market has not recovered as quickly as it usually does in these recoveries, and several reasons are given. One is the sharp increase in productivity. Another is the slow rate of confidence returning. And there are many economists predicting that the job level will stay relatively weak this year. This, in turn, could keep a slow pace of wage growth, and at some point, we could find with debt service rising in the sense of interest rates rising, could damper, I think, consumer spending and confidence. But I think that any slowdown in spending and housing could hopefully be offset by what we're starting to see now, was a beginning of higher capital expenditures. So although things are clearly improving in the U.S. economy, you still have these risks standing out there and an over-reliance on the U.S. economy worldwide. This means it is more critical than ever for countries in the emerging markets as well as the developed world to implement the necessary structural reforms to help strengthen their economies. The IIF reported last week that after falling to a 10-year low of $124 billion in 2002, private capital flows to the emerging economies rose to $187 billion in 2003 and are projected to go to almost $200 billion this year. I think these rising level of flows have been supported in many cases by sound economic policies and performance in many countries. However, along with this, we've seen easy monetary conditions and ample liquidity in financial markets, something we usually we like to see. However, we've also seen a dramatic compression of spreads. Now I think one of the risks we face in the markets is that we may be moving ahead of fundamentals, as was the case in early 1997, just prior to the Asian financial crisis. It is important, therefore, that this not lead to complacency, the high levels of liquidity. And I think it puts more importance than ever on countries, particularly in the emerging markets, but countries in general, to continue with their economic reforms and structural adjustments. There is also need for both investors and lenders to keep in mind the importance of differentiation among borrowers, not only in the emerging markets, but in general, and puts a heavy emphasis, I think, on all of us in the private sector to emphasize sound risk and credit judgment. I think that one of the things that we face here, if we do not do that with this type of liquidity sloshing around in the market and compression of spreads and lack of differentiation, any spike in interest rates or any event risk that should come about could spark a strong negative reaction in the markets. Since the early 90s, G7 growth in general has been closely correlated with capital flows to the emerging markets. And I think despite the improvement that we're seeing in general in the G7, I think that we have to be very careful, and particularly countries in the emerging markets, and relying overly much on any growth in the G7. When we look elsewhere outside the U.S., we don't find the same type of growth in the G7. The Eurozone is looking at about 1.7% growth this year, the UK at 3.5%, Canada 3.3%, and Japan is a mixed picture. The best that I've seen is sort of flat growth from last year of about 2%. The emerging markets are supposed to increase to over 5% from around 4.5% last year. And certainly the U.S. economy is leading the way. But I put out some of the, I think, risks and doubts that are out there about the U.S. economy. So I think it puts all the more need, I think, for other countries in the world to continue their policies of structural reform and adjustments, and for the private sector to make sure that we exercise very good credit and risk judgment. I think we're very fortunate to have a great panel here, and you see who they are. Alston, Correll, Chairman and CEO of Georgia Pacific; Don Evans, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce; Marty Feldstein, President and CEO of the National Bureau of Economic Research; Steve Newhouse, President of Morgan Stanley; and John Sweeney, President of the AFL-CIO. I've asked them, as they make their presentations, to comment on 5 points. 1, is the U.S. recovery sustainable? 2, how can the recovery benefit the labor market, and when will we see the major upturn in jobs? 3, what choices will the U.S. face in controlling deficits? 4, what are the forecasts for the level of U.S. dollar vis-à-vis the euro, yen, other currencies? 5, if the recent high growth rates of the U.S. economy continue, and I'm sure we'll get a very interesting answer from some of our panelists, will this assure President Bush's re-election? So, Alston, I will start off with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Like most U.S. CEOs, I see the world from my company's viewpoint. So let me just take you 2 seconds to tell you a little bit about Georgia Pacific. We're about a $20 billion corporation. We are the king of tissue, towel, and bathroom tissue and disposable tableware, primarily in the United States, but a big operation in Europe. We are the largest producer of residential housing materials in the United States, so we have a good feel for what's going on in the housing market, and we're a major player in the commodity forest products business, so we think we have a good feel for what's going on in world trade flows, because our country has been both an importer and an exporter of those materials. So far as what's going on with the American consumer, I think you have to be astounded with the behavior of the American consumer. The nice thing about bathroom tissue is we can tell you where the people in the United States are at any particular moment, and they returned to their lifestyle very quickly after 9/11. That is to say, they started traveling, they started eating out, they returned to restaurants, and the U.S. economy and the U.S. consumers' behavior returned to a norm very rapidly and has stayed there in spite in spite of concern. So we see the American consumer doing what they have traditionally done. In housing, we see a unique phenomenon. I'm one with a vast immigration in the United States, and the housing formation, we see the underpinnings of a very strong market, supported by the low interest rate. Says, quite frankly, most American consumers cannot afford to rent, and so we have seen an unbelievable growth in housing that remains strong, and most of the studies by most of the experts says this is not a bubble, but a change in behavior of the consumer, and that we will be at the level of housing starts that we're at now for quite some time, which bodes well for both spending, because the whole industry is a very large industry, and the fact that that with these interest rates and many fixed rates loans, there's much more stability in the economy than we thought. The wild card, of course, has been jobs. We see consumer non-durables in the United States go up, which has traditionally meant the jobs were created in the United States, but the jobs are not coming, and that's because, of course, many of the consumer non-durables are made now outside of the United States, and the materials to package them, et cetera, have been made outside the United States. For the first time in the fourth quarter, we started to see the economy respond to the fact that the dollar has been trading at the lower end of its historic range, and for the first time in a very long time, we are hiring. And we forecast that will continue. Trade flows, which had been abnormal because of the weakness of the dollar, have now reversed themselves to more historic norms. That is to say, the U.S. is exporting the things it has traditionally exported and importing the things it has traditionally imported without the anomalies created by the overly strong dollar. So we enter 2004 much more encouraged than we've been in a long time. The fourth quarter represented a watershed change in demand and in employment in our industry and in our company. I've been CEO for Georgia Pacific for about 11 years. To my knowledge, I have never been correct on any forecast I've made about anything. And so I would hesitate to forecast much of anything, except right now things feel better than they did yesterday, and that's better than they used to be. So thank you very much.
Don?
Bill, thank you. Alton, I'm glad to hear you're hiring. That's good news. That's a message I'm hearing more and more across America as I talk to CEOs and business leaders, small, medium, and large business owners across America. So I'm one that is very optimistic that the jobs are coming. I think Bill did a good job of covering a lot of the statistics as to kind of where the economy is right now, and it does feel good. I take a moment to put it into perspective. First, I guess I might say what a difference a year makes. I can remember being here a year ago, and the atmosphere was a little bit different than it is this year with respect to not only America and some of our positions in the world, but also our economy. I can remember being on a panel, and economists that will go unnamed certainly called into question the jobs and growth package that the president was proposing and the tax cuts that the president had been advancing, and he didn't feel like the tax cuts would have any stimulus to the economy, and of course I respectfully disagreed with that. I think it's now becoming clear that the pro-growth monetary policies, pro-growth fiscal policies that have been pursued in this economy as a part of this administration for the last 3 years are working. They're taking effect. We have been running against a pretty good headwind for about 3 years. When you go back 3 years and you recall the stock market that was collapsing, you understand that we entered into a recession that was on our plate when we showed up. You introduce into that the attack of 9/11. You follow that with corporate scandals. You put on top of that a march to war. You put in the place of that, in addition to that, a continuing war on terrorism. I mean, you can start to see some of the challenges that America has had with respect to the economy. But when you look at the long-term fundamentals of our economy today, they look very sound and very fundamental. And one of the fundamental advantages we've had going for us for the last 3 years is low inflation. Inflation has been in check for a number of years now in America, and that allows you to pursue pro-growth monetary, pro-growth fiscal kind of policies, and that's exactly what has been taking place. And so we see the results, though, beginning to kick in. Productivity has been remarkable. There's been a sea change in productivity growth in America in the last several years. I mean, we moved from a productivity growth level in the 80s of about 1.25% to 1.5%. In the 90s, maybe one might say it moved up in the 2 to 2.5% range. We've been seeing some remarkable unsustainable, but still third quarter of 2003, 9.3%, and the second quarter was 6.8%. You know, have we moved up into an even higher level now, a 3 to 3.5%? Is technology really starting to get, further penetrate the economy and further demonstrate to us how productivity should remain fairly strong for the foreseeable future. So I'm one that's optimistic that I feel like inflation is in check and will remain in check for quite some time. It will be give us the room to pursue the pro-growth fiscal and monetary kind of policies that we have been pursuing. Jobs are beginning to come. I mean, in the fourth quarter, we created some 250,000 jobs in our economy. Unemployment peaked at 6.3%. It's now down to 5.7%. Job security is much stronger in America today than it was a year ago or two years ago. Those people that have jobs certainly feel much more secure in the job that they have. Real disposable income is up through the first 3 quarters of 2003, 6.3%. So the consumers are confident, and they're spending, and they're driving the economy, and they have been driving the economy for the last 3 years, but now the business community is beginning to pick up. In the third quarter, you saw business investment pick up 18% in software and equipment. You had record corporate profits in the third quarter of $1.1 trillion. You've got a stock market that's added some $3 trillion in equity value over the last year, which means the equity window is open again, which means that companies can once again go back to the equity window as a source of funding to build their companies. And I would point to the cut, not only the tax cuts in general, but the tax cuts on dividends and tax cuts on capital gains. A big deal in terms of the markets, and a big deal in terms of providing lower cost capital to grow and expand. Interest rates has already been mentioned. It's at a 40-year low. We had housing starts in the month of December. We're at a 20-year high. Home ownership is at an all-time record high. And so, there are just lots of very solid positive data that supports the economy is strong and getting stronger. And as you listen to private economists across the country, they're all anticipating that the year 2004 will be a year of growth in the 4 to 4.5% kind of range, and the lion's share of them are forecasting that we'll see substantial job growth. I can't take a mic, though, without talking about the importance of free trade to continue to have a sustainable long-term growth, not only in the American economy, but the global economy. When you talk about what it is you can do to provide the conditions for long-term economic growth, you have to think about free trade, because that's where competition comes from, and from competition comes innovation, from innovation comes higher productivity leads to economic growth, that leads to higher standard of living, that leads to freedom. I mean, free trade is all about continuing to go down the road to freedom and peace and prosperity all around the world. About the deficit, let me say that we have had a national emergency. We had a recession on our plate when we arrived, and we are at war. And so those are 3 reasons why you can take almost any one of them, why it might be appropriate for a period of time to go through a time of deficits. Believe me, although we would say the deficits, and they're very manageable through this period, and they're affordable. The debt deficit, the debt level in the country is certainly below the historic average. We run about 36 or 37% right now. The historic average of debt to GDP in our country is about 40%. We are on plan to cut the deficit in our country in half within 5 years, get it down to about 2% of GDP. We will be making some very, very tough spending decisions, and you will be seeing that in the budgets to come. You have already seen it in some of the previous budgets. When we showed up, the budget that was delivered to us from the previous administration had 15% growth, 15% growth in the discretionary portion of the budget, ex-defense and homeland security. First year, we brought that down from 15% to 5%. The next year, we brought it down to 4%. The 2004 budget should come in at about 3%. And you will see more and more tough spending decisions come out of this administration because the president clearly understands that creating the conditions for long-term economic growth, making sure you have your fiscal policies correct for long-term economic growth, it means cutting taxes and controlling spending. Those are the two fundamental principles that you keep your eye on. So you'll continue to see from this administration a tougher and tougher stand on spending, believing, though, that we have created the conditions, and we have indeed, for economic growth. And along with economic growth, that simply means we have more resources for everybody. There's more resources to deal with the issues of the future. It means more revenues for the federal government. It means more revenues for state and local governments. And, of course, it means more for the people. So I'm optimistic. Feel like this recovery that is strong is getting stronger and will be sustainable for some a long period of time, and would say to you, the consumers and the business community feel the same way, because we see consumer confidence continuing to climb. We see businesses all across the country saying now is the time to invest. So I think the prospects are good, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. I guess I don't have to ask you the last point, which was about the economy and the re-election of President Bush, because we all know where you stand on that one. So we'll move on to you, Marty.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the U.S. Economic recovery is very much on track. I share the general view that real growth in the coming year will be about 4%, with more likely error on the upside than on the downside. The concerns that many of us had a year ago, would business investment pick up? Would the consumer be there? Those are history now. There's no doubt from the recent data that we've seen over the last 6 months that business investment in plant and equipment is strong. The consumer is confident and strong. What about employment, though? In spite of the strong increase in output, until now, the increase in jobs, as everybody knows, has been relatively slow. I'm convinced that the number of jobs will increase significantly in 2004. Yesterday, we had the weekly unemployment insurance numbers, and the Department of Labor reported that the average number of new claims for unemployment insurance over the last 4 weeks is the lowest in 3 years. So we're no longer seeing layoffs of the kind that were contributing to slow job growth in the past. Why am I optimistic about the likelihood of an increase in employment in the year ahead? Basically because the U.S. labor market works well. It continues to work well year after year, decade after decade. Compare the U.S. labor market with an unemployment rate of 5.7% with unemployment in France and Germany, which averages about 10% and has just remained very high. Or think back about how well the U.S. labor market has absorbed large numbers of immigrants, or a dramatic change over the last generation in the fraction of women who want to work. So our labor market works. People who want to find jobs get jobs. Doesn't work immediately, and we all know that the unemployment rate ought to be coming down from its current level. But I think that's going to happen in 2004. The increase in output that we've seen and the increase in output that will occur in 2004 will put more incomes in people's pockets, will put more profits in the hands of businesses, and that money has to go somewhere. And where it's going to go is into more production, more hiring, creating more jobs. The Michigan Survey of Consumer Expectations recently reported that the American households believe that the outlook for job creation in the year ahead is the best that it's been in some 20 years. So households have confidence in the outlook for jobs, and that's contributing to the strong consumer spending, which is adding to overall economic growth. Now, Bill asked us to comment on the fiscal deficit and on the current account deficit. Let me start with the fiscal deficit and make two basic points. First, although the deficit is large, it would be a mistake to compare budget deficits now with the budget deficits that we had some 20 years ago. The bond market is telling us that these deficits today are very, very different from the deficits that we had in the past. 20 years ago, the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond had an interest rate of 12%. Inflation was at 4%, so the real interest rate was 8%. Today, those same 10-year Treasury bonds have an interest rate of 4%, and after inflation, a real interest rate of only 2%. So the bond markets, which are probably the best gauge, the best indicator of how careful analysts are interpreting the outlook for the budget deficit, are telling us that that budget deficit is not going to explode, that that budget deficit is not going to be a burden on the capital markets. Indeed, the Congressional Budget Office in the United States, the official arm of the Congress that deals with these issues, recently reported some very interesting numbers. They reported that if the tax cuts are made permanent, as the President has requested, if we continue to have a relatively high level of defense spending, not as high as, of course, the Iraq War made necessary, but a continued high level of defense spending, and if we fix the so-called alternative minimum tax, we do all of those things, the budget deficit by 2009 will be down to $300 billion, which, when you compare it to a $14 trillion economy, which is the outlook for 2009, gives you a budget deficit of only 2.3% of GDP. Now, that may be too optimistic, although the CBO tries to give a realistic calculation in these numbers. But even if it turned out that instead of $300 billion, we had $400 billion, that would still mean a deficit relative to that massive $14 trillion economy of less than 3%. So we'd qualify for the Maastricht rules. The second point that I want to make about fiscal deficits is that, of course, there is a longer-term problem, not only in the United States, but in almost every industrial country around the world, caused by the aging of the population and therefore the increasing costs of Social Security and related programs for the aged. I think that's why it is so important that we get on with the reforms of Social Security of the sort that President Bush spoke about recently in the State of the Union message. What about the current account deficit with the rest of the world? We have a $550 billion current account deficit, about 5% of GDP. We're drawing in that much capital from the rest of the world. More than half of that inflow is coming from foreign central banks. Japan last year spent more than $190 billion buying U.S. bonds. So there's a risk if investors, including those central banks, were to lose some of their appetite for U.S. Treasury bonds, long-term rates in the United States could rise. It's a risk, but it's certainly not my prediction. I think that the current account deficit and the trade deficit can be brought down gradually in a healthy way. In the future, I think there are going to be two things that will shrink our trade and current account deficit. First, stronger growth in the rest of the world. And Bill gave you a sense that we're beginning to see some improvements in Europe and in Japan, and certainly strong growth in China, strong growth in India. So that growth will lead to an improvement in U.S. exports and a shrinking of our trade deficit. In addition to that, the decline in the dollar, which has occurred over the last year or so, now down about 10%, a little more than 10% on a global trade-weighted basis, will also make U.S. products more competitive in global markets, and that will lead to a shrinking of our trade deficit. And we've seen some of that recently. Perhaps at a more fundamental level, what we know is that the only thing that can reduce our current account deficit in a healthy way is an increase in our national saving rate. And I think we're going to see that. After all, profits are up, so business saving, business retained earnings will rise. I've already commented on the fact that the government budget deficit will be coming down relative to GDP, so we'll get more saving from that source. And then finally, households are now still at a very, very low saving rate, about 3% of disposable after-tax income, and that undoubtedly will start to go back toward its more normal levels that we've had in the U.S. in the past, in the range of 9 or 10%. None of that is a substitute for a continuing adjustment of exchange rates, but it does say that we can reduce the current account deficit without an increase in long-term rates in the United States. Finally, let me respond to Bill's question about what happens after 2004. Certainly, longer-term forecasting is a dangerous activity, but I think we can all take comfort from the historic record that economic expansions don't die of old age. They don't just run out of steam. Economic expansions are killed off. Economic expansions end when the inflation rate becomes so high that the Federal Reserve has to step on the brake and bring down the rate of inflation. If you look back over the last half century, that has been the story of each of the recessions that we've had. I see little danger at this point that we're going to see the kind of inflation conditions that would cause that kind of contractionary policy. Over the last 12 months, consumer prices are up less than 2%. You take out volatile food and energy, 1.1%. So the Fed can maintain a quite relaxed position, gradually raising interest rates, but not doing anything that will kill off this recovery.
Thank you, Marty, for your usual insightful presentation on the economy today and where you think it's going forward and on some of the problems. Now we're going to hear from Steve Newhouse, who will give a view from the financial sector. Steve?
Well, I find that on these panels, the further you are down the line, the shorter your remarks get, because as everybody else ticks off some of the items that were on your list. And I am by nature an optimist, as so far virtually everybody's been. But I think it might be more useful, therefore, for me to be a little bit of an agent provocateur here and talk about the other side of, or at least the potential other side of the issue. I have been involved, because I am an optimist, in a good-natured debate for the last couple of years with Morgan Stanley's very astute but perennially gloomy chief economist, Steve Roach, mostly about the probability of a robust recovery in the U.S. economy in 2003. And he was pessimistic, of course, and I was optimistic. And I am well ahead on points in that debate. But I now find myself in the uncomfortable position, or at least unaccustomed position, of being pretty sympathetic with some of the concerns that Steve has about the sustainability of this recovery. And I would suggest that the question that's been posed here, which is, will the U.S. economy recover enough to help the world, may be the wrong question. In the last 7 years, from 1995 to 2002, in fact, the U.S. has provided about 96% of the GDP growth for the entire world. And there has developed, I think, an implicit bargain between the U.S. and the rest of the world, which is, I will buy your goods and you will finance it for me by buying my debt securities. And the result has been predictable. We have a record current account deficit. We have record levels of consumer debt in the country, record low savings levels in the country. And that's all potentially not disastrous, as we've heard here. And I think the Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, has said in a couple of his speeches in January, has been reassuring by saying that what looked like it was unsustainable based on historical precedent is in fact not unsustainable because the goalposts have been moved by the development and flexibility of global financial intermediation and the ability to finance these deficits, which, as you know, are now at $2 billion a day for the U.S. and in the face of a weakening currency that these obligations are denominated again. I would agree. It's clear that the goalposts have been moved in terms of what's sustainable and what's not sustainable, but I don't think the goalposts have been taken down. And so the question I would pose is not whether the U.S. can recover enough to help the rest of the world, but whether the rest of the world, ex-China and some other economies in Asia, can begin to recover enough to help the U.S. To sustain what is a terribly unbalanced burden in terms of providing aggregate demand and providing the growth stimulus for the rest of the world. Clearly, it's a robust recovery in the U.S. Clearly, it will, and I think by consensus, go through the remainder of this election year and into next year. Is it sustainable indefinitely without some rebalancing through growth of aggregate demand in the rest of the world, and again, particularly in Europe? I just don't know the answer to that question. I will say this: some of the issues are troubling. Consumer debt is at record levels, but the rejoinder to that is that the debt burden, the debt servicing burden for those record levels has been moderated by low interest rates, and that's certainly true. And consumer debt service as a percentage of disposable income is not at record levels. But it is at the top decile of where it's been historically, and that's in a very low interest rate environment. So when you contemplate what might happen if there is a move in interest rates in the U.S. to the consumer's ability to continue to sustain this kind of a recovery, you can get fairly nervous and concerned. So I am optimistic, but I'm concerned. I'm worried. I think that the imbalances in the global economy need to be redressed. I think that the policy options in the U.S. have been largely exhausted, although very effectively used. But I think we're going to need some help and some balance from the rest of the global economies, and particularly, again, here where we are in Europe, in order to get this engine, or rather allow this engine to move for a sustained long-term period. So that's to be provocative.
Thanks, Steve. I can attest that Steve has usually been the optimist. I think his point about, the U.S. locomotive needing some help in the rest of the G7, I think, is a very good point, as you could see by some of the statistics I threw out earlier. And so, John, you're our cleanup hitter, and I know you're going to have something to say about job growth. John?
Well, on every panel like this distinguished panel here today, there has to be one troublemaker, and that's why they invited Sweeney to be here. I think the last part of the question that Bill posed to us in terms of the president's reelection is really depends on what happens in answer to the question that we're talking about here today. As you've heard, there has been a tremendous emphasis on the jobs record, and I think that the jobs record has been the worst of any president since the Great Depression. 15 million Americans are without jobs. Some of them may be working part-time because they can't find full-time employment. Yes, growth is up, but neither jobs nor wages have recovered. We've lost manufacturing jobs every month for the past 43 months in a row. The flow of jobs abroad has now turned into a tidal wave, with white-collar jobs, information technology, and service jobs following manufacturing jobs. We saw the announcement today on Kodak. For working families, things are still getting worse and not better. Wages are stagnant, health care is broken, poverty is spreading, college tuitions are soaring, public schools are laying off teachers and doubling up classes, retirement dreams are shattered. People see America's greatest strength, its middle class, being chipped away. Everybody who's not rich lives paycheck to paycheck and fears that they're just one pink slip away from disaster. People are deeply worried about the future, too. They fear that the jobs their children will be able to get will not be good jobs, that there'll be jobs which will lack health insurance and retirement security. In each of these areas, the administration has either done nothing or made things worse. They've mortgaged the store with their tax cuts. They've produced a recovery that isn't reaching most Americans. So I'd say, despite all of the advantages, the re-election of the president is an open question. What is forecast for dollars versus the euro and other currencies, which has been referred to, trade deficits are at record levels that cannot be sustained. America's leading investor, Warren Buffett, announced that for the first time in 50 years, he's going to invest abroad and bet against the dollar. There's no reason to think that he's wrong. This can't go on. The IMF warns the United States trade deficits threaten the global economy. The U.S. is still the consumer of last resort for countries around the world. But U.S. jobs are down, wages aren't keeping up, family debts are at record heights, and this can't be sustained economically or politically. What is needed is clear, coordinated efforts to rev up global growth. While the United States moves slowly to balance its trade and challenges countries like China that are playing by their own set of rules, at this point the administration seems unable or unwilling to take the lead. What choices will the United States face in controlling deficits? Bad choices. Deficit spending was necessary to get the economy going. But deficit spending that invests in job creation and basic needs is very different from deficit spending, which is built on tax cuts for upper-end taxpayers. The administration has made every effort to top-end tax cuts, created deficits as far as the eye can see, without yet generating a job or a wage recovery. So the deficits will rise, and the deficit reduction plans are really faith-based policy, prayer substitutes for actions. In the short term, the United States needs deficits to get the economy moving and put people to work. Then we'll have no choice but to roll back the reckless and irresponsible top-end tax cuts to which the administration has been addicted. Spending cuts alone won't do it. The test of leadership will be whether the business community and the financial community are really prepared to say that clearly and loudly. Can the recovery benefit labor markets? This jobless recovery is something that we've not seen before. Profits are up, productivity is up, growth is up. But the only decent jobs being created are largely in the public sector. 2/3 of the new jobs are part-time jobs. The jobs being created pay less than the jobs that were lost. One of the biggest concerns of working people is that the jobs being created come without health care and without retirement benefits, and of course, without any loyalty to employees. Even strong growth may have little labor effect in the current condition. The leading employer in America is Walmart, which has mastered how to operate in the new global economy. It pays its workers less than a poverty wages. It crushes all efforts for workers to try to organize. The New York Times just reported on the grotesque practices of locking overnight workers in the plant at night. Walmart consumes 10% of all U.S. imports from China and uses its weight to drive Chinese wages down below the official minimum wage. Walmart's workers have jobs, but they can't afford health care, and they can't afford housing, and they can't provide for retirement, and they certainly can't save for their kids to go to college. If Walmart is the model company for the new global economy, then even a strong recovery could have little effect on working families.
Thank you, John, for answering all my questions. Now we've got about 27 minutes here for questions. I'm going to stand at the podium so I can see in the back here, and you can either direct them to the panel as a whole or to any individual member of the panel, and you might just give your name and company affiliation.
I don't guess I would get a rebuttal right now.
Yes. When I say company affiliation, any affiliation you have.
My name is, excuse me, Paul Hodge, and I'm director of the Harvard Generations Policy Project. My question for the panel is, and Bonk, is the aging of the American population, the aging of the European population in Japan, and how you view this demographic or these demographic tsunamis affecting the economic growth of the United States.
Okay. Marty, you want to start with that, and we'll move through the rest of the panel?
The aging of the population has the effect of reducing our saving rate. It's one of the reasons why we have a lower saving rate, because after all, the younger people are the savers and the older people are traditionally the dissavers. But I think what it really does all around the world is to pose a challenge to governments to find ways of modifying existing Social Security pension rules, also encouraging the growth of private pensions. The U.S. is not in the lead in achieving those reforms. There are other countries like Australia and even Sweden that have developed more effective, more efficient Social Security pension systems that have the kind of mixture of public and private components. But we are way ahead in terms of private pensions of what goes on in many European countries. But I think that's going to be the challenge for the decade ahead, to find a way to maintain the incomes of retirees without increasing taxes at a time when the number of retirees is growing relative to the rest of the population.
Thanks, Mike. Don, you want to comment on that?
Well, I would just simply, add to what Marty said. It's one, simple reason why the president is putting so much emphasis on savings, retirement savings account, lifetime savings account, and talking about Social Security. That was a very central part of the 2000 campaign, continues to be a very high priority issue within the administration. A commission is out there continuing to study the issue, work the issue, because we certainly understand the importance of it. Marty mentioned a couple of countries that are ahead of the U.S., maybe in other countries. I would add Chile to the mix, too. Chile's a country that put a kind of a private savings Social Security system in place some 24 years ago, and it's remarkable what it has meant is it's allowed the power of the equity markets to compound over the last 24 years, and what it will provide now for retirement for the people of Chile. And so it's just, there's a number of classic examples out there as if you put a system in place that allows the equity markets to compound over a long period of time, 10, 20, 30-year kind of period. It is one of the elements to the solution, but it's a central issue right now with all countries, including the United States. Believe me, we are very focused on it. It's why the President continues to mention it, and it's why he once again has mentioned the importance of private savings accounts within the Social Security system, particularly with those younger in age, younger Americans.
Thanks, Don. Steve?
Just one point, which is not an issue for the U.S. economy, which at least not at this point, which was the focus of the question again, but which is certainly an issue for other economies in the world, and again, particularly here in Europe, where I've lived for the last 5 years now. And that is that we're all familiar with the effect of demographics on the aging of the population, the burden that's going to put on financing retirement and pensions. But there's another thing going on at the other end, and that is decline in population in a number of the major economies in Europe. And the implications for that decline in population and a reduction in the size of the prospective labor force and the impact that will have on the equation of economic growth in countries like Spain and Germany and others is also a real serious issue. And it is, again, conventional wisdom suggests that immigration from the East may be able to alleviate that problem. But when you look at the actual statistics about the kind of immigration you'd have to make up for the prospective declines in population, it is a very daunting, again, issue of this demographic shift that we're in right now. So aging is one thing, but shrinking is another, and both of them have to be dealt with.
I think your point also, Steve, is relevant to Japan. John?
I think that the aging population is a serious consideration in terms of the economic issues that we're talking about. We have in the United States one of the most successful social programs in our Social Security program. And we have to do everything we can to build the confidence of workers in the soundness of the Social Security system. And that also applies to building the confidence of young workers that the Social Security system will be there for them when they do retire. We have to take a hard look in terms of private pensions and the fact that there are a declining number of workers covered by private pensions in our own country, and it is necessary in the case of most workers to have both the Social Security as well as a private pension in order to survive in their retirement. And I think that we also have to take a look at wage issues as how they relate to savings. It's important to build our savings, no question about it, but people have to make enough so they can save.
Thanks, John. Yes, we have a question here.
My name is Uday Kotak from Kotak Mahindra Bank, India. Last year, a similar panel was asked a question. 1 year from now, where will the US dollar be? And therefore, I would like to ask this panel the question. The panel last year answered by saying that it will be weaker than where it is. And while there were differences on the size of the weakness, it was a reasonable unanimity to that. The same question is asked to the panel now, that when we assemble again 1 year from now, in general, against the basket of key currencies, will the US dollar be weaker or stronger?
Okay, Steve, why don't you start with that one?
I think that I talked about imbalances, and the way imbalances are redressed, at least in part, is by price adjustments. And the most obvious and effective price adjustment that we have in the absence of growth from other parts of the world for at least beginning to redress these imbalances is in the price of the currencies. And so I think all things being equal, the dollar is going to be weaker against most major currencies next year at this time.
Thanks, Steve. I think we have a comment here from corporate America on that question, which is very important for them, particularly if you're an exporter and importer.
Well, we would agree with Steve. All we see going on would certainly leave us to believe that we ought to base our premise on a weakening dollar over a period of time, not breaking precedent in new historic trading ranges, but continue to move down lower in the historic trading range.
Don?
I don't talk about the dollar, and I don't talk about what those in the administration say about the dollar. within the administration, that's we talk about the dollar from the President and the Secretary of the Treasury.
What I will do, though, in addition
That's
to
my
Don
comment.
mentioning it to the Secretary of the Treasury, when I talk to John Snow, I'll tell him that he ought to come here next year, because you'll ask the same question. All right, Marty?
I'm one of those who think the word weakening and strengthening ought to be banned from the discussion about the dollar, because I would say the dollar is going to be more competitive a year from now. That's really...
Marty is a diplomat at heart, as you can see. Okay, John, as always, I'm giving you the last word here. You're our cleanup hitter.
No, I bow to some of the other panelists here, and I'm hopeful that the dollar is going to be strengthened.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Okay, over there.
I'm Jain from National Thermal Power Corporation of India. Secretary Evans mentioned in the last part of his remarks about the free trade. This has been a very hot subject debated recently. What we are talking generally is in the context of a very free business environment globally. And in that context, not only the material movement, but also the human movement, the men, becomes important, which we have been discussing in ILO very substantially. Now, when we discuss in WTO, we always argue about free movement of the material from one place to other, reduce the restrictions on that. But when it comes to the manpower, and when we discuss the same in ILO, that there should be a free movement of the man resource also, there is a different thinking. Conceptually, when we are looking on a business environment which is globally non-restrictive, both the commodities, which is the part of the business environment, conceptually should be treated on an equal footing. What do you have to say on that?
Last part of what you said. What would you say, Dan?
What I said was that when we are talking of removing restriction or movement of materials, a free trade, the similar argument should go in the context of the movement of manpower from one place to other place.
Right.
Because on the one hand, we are talking of free trade, but on the other hand, we are even restricting the outsourcings, which is also a very debatable subject right now.
Right, right. Well, you know, I think to put this in perspective, one, I would say, look, the global economy is more integrated, more interlinked, more networked, more multinational than anybody thought imaginable even, say, 5 years ago. And so just the integration of the flow of materials and goods and services around the world has increased dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. When it comes to outsourcing, I think it's good to put in perspective from at least America's point of view. And that is that America, we've got an incredible job creation machine in that we create about 1 million new jobs every week in America. Now, there are, number of people leaving jobs every week. But there are about 1 million new jobs that people are moving into every week. So we're creating about 52 million new jobs a year. Now, of course, the challenge is to make sure that if you're creating 52 million jobs every year, well, there's people only leaving whatever, 48 million jobs a year, 47 or 49. So when you put that up against some of the outsourcing concerns I've heard people talk about and seen some of the studies from McKinsey and Forrester and others, they talk about the potential impact on the American economy of a couple of 100,000 a year. I mean, nobody knows for sure. And so I'm not one that sees, I don't see it being restricted, one. I think you were talking about the restrictions that were being placed on it. I'm not aware of restrictions of outsourcing taking place. I'm not not aware of that if it's occurring. And so, but I think, we just need to continue to understand that this is going to be a global economy that continues to open up more trade, continues to become more integrated, continue to share more manpower across borders. I don't think that's going to slow down, and I think it's healthy for a growing global economy. As I said in my opening remarks, I don't think there's anything, more important than free and open trade, and that's what America is going to continue to push for. And I think that, so I don't see restrictions of outsourcing, and we'll continue to see, I think, a more integrated global economy.
Thank you, Don. You want to comment on that, Steve?
Well, I only got past Economics 101 in school, but I do remember the law of comparative advantage. And, the development of global economy suggests that when jobs and industries are better suited for an environment that has a lower cost structure, they move there. And I think that if there is a positive aspect to the challenges we face, it is the U.S. economy, which is the locomotive that we said, is the most flexible economy in the world, and probably in the history of the world. And I know John will have some issues to raise with the dislocations that this causes, but I remember back in the early 90s, we went through a similar process with a number of industries which were no longer competitive globally. There were dislocations, but in fact, ultimately, the economy in the U.S. adjusted, and people found better jobs, higher-paying jobs, which fueled the expansion of the late 90s, primarily in service industries versus some of the manufacturing jobs. We adapted, and we're going to have to adapt again. It's going to be painful, perhaps, no question about that. Some people are going to suffer, and it's up to government to ameliorate that as much as possible, I think. But ultimately, we will adapt, and it will be a successful change, as it has been in the past.
Thank you, Steve. John?
I think we all realize the importance of trade and the importance of globalization. The question is the rules. When we talk about outsourcing, we're not talking about necessarily the movement of jobs. We're talking about the kind of jobs, and high-priced, high-paid jobs in the United States moving to the lowest possible wage. We're talking about the workers in China as much as we're talking about the workers at home and the conditions that they work under. We're talking about core labor standards and the rights of workers to assemble, to organize, the basic rights of freedom in the countries, our trading partners, as well as in our own country. We're talking about the pain that workers must endure who are suffering as a result of some of this movement and some of these changes. And how do we address that? How do we, relatively small things like the extension of unemployment benefits in a high unemployment period, the training of dislocated workers, the aid and the assistance that's provided to those workers, and how do we make sure that corporations are taking the high road as they move around the world and not necessarily going the lowest possible way. 10 years ago, we opposed NAFTA. Over the past 10 years, we've seen what's happened to NAFTA and the impact that it's had on Mexican workers and the economy in Mexico. And today, 10 years later, we see those same jobs that left the United States leaving Mexico and going to China for the lowest possible deal, and the Mexican economy suffering, and the workers in Mexico suffering poverty and unemployment, the likes of which they've never seen before.
Marty, would you like to comment on this?
Not really. I think
We've got
about every aspect has already been covered.
Yeah, let me surprise everybody and say that on many of the comments John stated, I totally agree with, in that I think government has a very important role to play in the transitioning of workers as economies change. And our economies are changing much faster, much more dramatically than anybody ever imagined. And that means people need new skills to be competitive. That means there needs to be programs in place to really assist workers that are seeing their industries no longer competitive, as was said a moment ago, no longer competitive with other countries of the world. And so we need to have training programs in place. That's why the President of the State of the Union talked to an over $200 million program with community colleges that would be partnerships that would provide training for these for workers that were in transition. No longer do we have an economy in the world where somebody goes to work for a company out of high school or college and stays there for a career. Oh yeah, some people will, but it's not like it was decades ago or a few generations ago. Now in somebody's lifetime, they're likely to change jobs a half a dozen times. And so government has to play a role in helping workers through and families through that transition. I mean, we don't leave anybody out in America. We don't leave anybody behind in America, and we have to have programs in place that deal with that. It's another reason why the President was proposing reemployment accounts, where you give an employee cash to go for training or child care or moving expense, whatever it is. But I agree with John totally. I mean, I think there's a very important role for governments to play in helping workers through the transition period.
Now Steve and then John.
I get myself really out on a limb here and in trouble. I'm an American citizen. My family's in America. The strains that this readjustment causes in America and in Europe are I feel them. But I've spent the last 15 years going to China as well. And if you look at the difference in the standard of living in China among 1.25 billion people, or at least under the 600 million you can see if you're within 200 miles of the coast. This has not been a lose-lose situation, in fact, and the development and the standard of living among the largest population in the world in Asia has been startling in terms of the improvements that have taken place in that part of the world and in that economy, which was in the Stone Age as recently as 15, 18 years ago.
John?
No, I just want to ask all of you to be witnesses. We're going to make sure the Secretary holds to all of his commitments here.
And I think this question really provoked a very interesting discussion. But this is an issue just not for the United States. This is a worldwide issue. As someone mentioned, if we were sitting in Mexico today, we'd be having a similar conversation of what's necessary to retain jobs that are now going from Mexico to China. And I find this as I go around the world. So I think it's a worldwide issue, not just a U.S. issue. And it has to be dealt with. Some of the comments that Steve made and Don and John, I think, about job training and the need to help in this transformation are really key to what we face in the world today, virtually everywhere. Yes. I think we have time probably for just one more here.
I'm Xinghai Fang from the Shanghai Stock Exchange. I have one question for Mr. Sweeney. Now, in your comment, you mentioned China a lot, but in fact, a lot of these high-paying jobs that perhaps moved out of the U.S. and moved to other countries, perhaps they move more to India than to China, particularly in the service area. And I was wondering why didn't you mention India at all? And also, don't you think that these workers in China also deserve a better life?
What was the last part?
John?
They sure do. And that's part of what we are trying to advocate in terms of trade policies and human rights policies. I'm a part of the international labor movement, active in the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. And we have asked for the opportunity to meet with some of the dissidents in China, some of the people who have been imprisoned on human rights issues. And the government will not allow us to meet those workers who are suffering some of the worst hardships. We want to see the economy of China improve. We want to see the workers have better standards in terms of their rights and their freedoms, as well as their standard of living, and that's what we're advocating.
I will say, just to add something, just having been recently in China, and as Steve, I've been traveling there regularly over the years, I think the administration has pushed very hard with the new leadership about several things. One, I think, is on buying American products and taking steps on the current account deficit, opening up the capital accounts, etc. And I think we're starting to see specific measures in this regard, and I encourage you, Don, you and your colleagues, to keep that up. And I think the government is responding. The question you asked, again, is a key one, and it doesn't just pertain to, obviously, to China. It also pertains to India and other countries, too. We actually have time for one more. So since we've got this great panel, I'm sure, yes, back there. No, you really grabbed that, unfortunately.
Sorry.
Go on.
Thomas Recke from Financial Times Deutschland, the German edition from FT. I'd like to ask to Martin, you referred to Europe and the unemployment rates in Europe. Compared to say that the US is the US performance is very good. I'd like to know if the US would have had European-style monetary and fiscal policy, what would have been the unemployment rate in the US now, and the other way around, what would have been the rate in Europe with US-style macro policy?
Marty?
I think the European problem is deeper than recent cyclical monetary and fiscal policy. I think the high levels of unemployment have persisted in France and Germany and elsewhere for a very long time because of much more fundamental problems about the operation of labor markets, about the operation of retailing, the operation of companies. And those are the changes that really need to be made to both to bring down the unemployment rates in European countries and also to increase the productivity growth there.
Yeah. Steve?
Actually, I was going to go back to the last question, which the gentleman from China raised, and I think that, one of the things you got to be careful of is focusing on how much further China may have to go in terms of standard of living and in terms of working conditions, rather than how far China has come from where it was a decade or 20 years ago. And in fact, the standard of living, the working conditions, and virtually everything else that has to do with the economic environment in China is just dramatically improved over what it's been. It may not be up to the standards which we might require in some of the Western economies, but the progress has been tremendous, and it's been probably one of the most successfully managed expansions of an economy anywhere in the world.
Okay, I think we have one here, one last one, right here. You had your hand up.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I see you were so intrigued by the question and Steve's answer here that you almost forgot yours.
Well, my name is Prakash Hinduja. We are from the Hinduja group of companies. We see that the U.S. economy is linked with the world. Everybody is invested in dollars in a big way. We heard about what's going to happen in the future of the dollar. But we know for every problem there is a solution. And we want the Americans experts should advise the world and see both the sides that how they can take a precautions or an insurance or some way or the other to protect if the dollar doesn't U-turns. Where do we stand? Is the question of the world. So I wanted to just put this question and see India also is one of the part. Thank you.
Steve? Okay, Don never passes on anything. I've never heard Don pass on a question.
I can assure you that.
Okay, Marty, I guess it falls to you, which is I knew where it was going to fall anyway.
Well, of course, we've witnessed a few years ago some terrible crises in Asia and Latin America, and I think some important lessons have been learned. You said, what kind of insurance can companies take out? What can they do to protect themselves? And I think countries are protecting themselves. We no longer have the kind of fixed exchange rate system of overvalued exchange rates that led to the crises in Thailand and Indonesia and elsewhere. We no longer have very small levels of foreign exchange reserves. India recently passed $100 billion in its foreign exchange reserves. So countries are protecting themselves and they're adopting international policies which make them much less likely to get into the kind of crises that we had before. So I think that adds to the general optimism that we should feel about the prospects for the global economy.
I will say this, again, going back to what Chairman Greenspan has suggested, which I believe is in large part true, the ability of the global financial system to flexibly intermediate some of these imbalances, and the tools that we have available to us are certainly much better than they've been in the past. The question, of course, that I raised earlier is whether they're so good that they can basically eliminate the risk, and I think the answer to that will always remain probably not. But we're much better at it than we were in the past.
I agree. We've seen a lot of improvements, but the risk is always out there, and the whole question is doing the job to try and prevent it, because risk management is great, but risk prevention is really what you're after. Let's give this great panel a big hand.